Okay, so in the final part of this week's topic, we're going to look at gang, stigma and class. So when it comes to those UK riots, many social commentators and sociologists, and criminologists and a bunch of experts pointed to the historical, political and economic causes of the riots. And they did this publicly and they did the best they could, but of course the UK government tried to firmly place the blame on what they called gangs, even though, it's very dubious whether those things really exist that much, certainly to the extent where they could cause massive large-scale riots across multiple cities. So there's a real shift in rhetoric around here about the politics of youth crime and gangs in London. Previously there was these kind of efforts to try and minimise gang activity and minimise criminality through various youth work kind of initiatives. This idea of hug a hoodie, and there was, as you can see there, the ad there, yo plebs were all in this thing together, trying to kind of reach out to young people in some ways. Then the rhetoric pretty much changed to criminality, pure and simple. So this, I think, kind of public discourse really relates to what I think is some excellent sociological analysis in the UK around the idea of the chav. Particularly see Imogen Tyler's awesome book Revolting Subjects and her more recent book Stigma on this. And also the work of Beverly Skeggs and her colleagues throughout the 2000s that have kind of shown particularly the intersections between class and gender when it comes to this kind of stuff. So you have very quickly kind of very outraged moral panic orientation towards, the apparent cause of this thing. And you have these kind of, speechifying by various government officials and the Prime Minister. You can see the quote there, I'm not going to read it out. But, after initially claiming that 28% of those arrested in London were gang members, they quickly downsized this number to 19 and really dropped it to 13%. By the time the government published the policies, really the very idea of, and reports on this stuff, the idea of the gangs was almost gone out of explanation. So obviously from a sociological perspective, we want to ask, why is it apparent the need to lay the blame on almost non-existent gangs? Who benefits from this? So as Tyler's reading points out, that's the required reading for this topic, this kind of resonates with the often promoted idea of an underclass. And this has been particularly a rhetoric in the UK and the US, where there's a kind of victim blaming, scapegoating and moral pathologizing of people, that are in positions of disadvantage and poverty. So the idea of the term underclass is used to objectify, make abject these people. It kind of almost animalizes them. Ram home workfare policies, and this has kind of echoes of disaster capitalism. So what disaster capitalism is that whenever there's a disaster, rather than kind of fix the problem, often what happens is people move in and try and make money out of it, and try and enforce their own will on things. So this is particularly the case around after the tsunami in the 2000s, where there was relatively poor people living on beaches around Sri Lanka and other places where the tsunami affected. When all those kind of houses get wiped out, in come multinational corporations and buy that place up and build resorts or build expensive apartments. That they take advantage of the disaster. There's a similar thing going on here, where there's kind of what happens when there's large scale public protests and public upheavals like this, is there's often particular groups that are blamed about it, to try and kind of paper over the cracks of what's actually the problem here and not really do anything about it. Why? Because most of the time the government's serving relatively privileged people and they don't want to stop doing that. So as Tyler points out, there's kind of symbolic violence going on here. The work of the moral panics, what has come to be called penal pornography by Loic Waquant. There's stigmatization going on in terms of form of governance, what she calls scum semiotics, the symbolic use of kind of pathologizing people and insulting them and calling them animals and all that kind of thing. And this kind of makes this kind of culture of inequality kind of almost normalized. What it does is kind of shift the blame from very unfair systems at the moment where most of the wealth is being funneled to the top and we have decimated labour markets and precarity and all that kind of thing, and starts to kind of blame people that are on the pointy end of this for their apparent own inadequacies or their own poor choices or their own violence or whatever. It inverts the problem. It blames individuals for wider systemic problems. So for Tyler and many other sociologists, they see when riots happen here as a kind of expression of class struggle. And they come to express their frustrations with their own positions in the world. So this also speaks to that youth as class figure that I was talking about in the Weeks on Figures, and I've got some quotes there out of a paper that I wrote a few years ago with Alan France. So this kind of talking about youth as this one thing kind of often distorts. So you can see this in kind of different protests that happened in the UK. There were student protests in 2010 about the kind of rising fees, and these were kind of seen as relatively legitimate forms of protest because they were largely done by the middle class. They were largely done in a kind of pantomime way where people are kind of holding up placards and dressing up and singing songs and stuff. Doesn't really have a lot of effect. Certainly didn't affect the fees debate very much, but it does kind of maybe have some small political effects in terms of parties worrying about the middle class vote, because that's particularly who they're talking to when it comes to elections. When it comes to the disturbances in London, obviously they were violent and there was damage. And then rather than think about what causes this, it's just basically disciplinary techniques brought in about forcing people to work, removing their welfare, social housing and all this kind of stuff, removing some of the very supports that are probably alleviating things like that happening more often. What's interesting about comparing those things is that, you can see this, there's very real treatment of young people, from the middle class to the so-called underclass here, that when talking about youth as a kind of one thing, it kind of, again, papers over the real differences between how different young people experience day-to-day life. Both those protests are examples of young people getting out on the streets and protesting, but they're treated very differently. So the idea that young people can be a class in and of and for itself really doesn't make a lot of sense, because there's such great class, race and ethnicity and gender differences within that group. So certainly, as I've talked about already, this kind of also relates to the increasing criminalisation of protest. Protest itself has been increasingly criminalised, to where most gatherings of people protesting is reported almost always like a riot. You can see that this is the kind of main way that even very peaceful protests are framed now. So the privatisation of public space we've spoken about, more regulations, less space to actually express yourself, less things allowed. And this kind of has profound effects on, democratic rights in terms of being able to, protest for things that we care about. This has certainly accelerated since the anti-globalisation movements that I spoke about in terms of culture jamming. In many ways, some of those large-scale mass protests back then were quite successful around some of those large economic summits, but powerful interests kind of learned how to kind of deal with that and started using fencing and kettling and these kind of things to, stop people have access to these things. So, whenever there are global summits such as the G8 or APEC, police and armies essentially wall off these places and then, force people into designated protest areas. In fact, groups increasingly have to apply to protest, which, is quite absurd. So if you're interested in looking at aspects of that, there's some prominent text down there. Mike Davis's classic 90s text about Los Angeles, Henry Giroux's book Youth in Revolt, and David Graeber's The Democracy Project, which he talks about the movement that he was involved in that coined the phrase "We are the 99%." And again, I've put in the kind of a photo there about, when it comes to a protest, who turns it into the riot? I would say the people dressed ready for the violence are more likely to be the ones causing it. And there's, again, much documentary evidence about, who starts violence in these kind of situations. Okay, so to conclude, When you're reading something like a protest or a riot, and the 2011 ones in the UK having a whole wealth of material to look at to do this, they can be read in a number of ways. So certainly the importance of local history and culture in understanding the relationships of what youth crime happens there, the relationships between groups of young people and authorities is important. More broadly, we can think about this kind of broader social conditions around anger, enemy, alienation, exploitation, rising inequalities, things like that, and how they affect marginalised youth. And this particularly is the case in large cities. And how the kind of role of politics and media and how these kind of important discourses define and respond to youth crime and young people's lives in general. If they feel they're being scapegoated and ignored, it kind of adds to the ingredients of these kind of uprisings happening. So this is kind of when we think about a flashpoint that symbolises that these flashpoints don't kind of come from nowhere. They symbolise underlying problems that the marginalised experience. And I think this is kind of the key takeout when these kind of large-scale things happen. They aren't just kind of some kind of violent response to nothing. They tend to be the response to long-held and long-experienced problems. So, if you're interested in looking at this more, and I think you can do assessment on this in the course, there's a couple of special issues of journals that have a lot of material on the 2011 riots. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.